today, but also perspectives.
Very good. I think we will have a very interesting session today. Looks very promising. I can see also among the name Dr. Sumita from Inti College. Let's wait a couple of minutes more. Okay, Renato, I think we can start. So good morning everybody. Thanks for having taken the time for attending this first Center for Market Education webinar. We present to you a very technical topic, if you want, and hopefully we'll drag the attention a little bit out of the topic of the day, COVID-19. So there is something else also happening in the world, and it's good to recognize the complexity around us. My name is Carmelo Ferlito, and I'm the director of the Center for Market Education. CME is an educational initiative supported by IDEAS, the Institute for Democracy and Economic Affairs in Kuala Lumpur. And within the IDEAS activity, CME has more an educational touch. So our aim is to promote pluralism within the economics profession, and to try to bring to non-economists typically economic topics, explain in a way that will allow lay people to understand the relevance of economics for our daily life. This is our main attempt. This is our third event. We had an academic colloquium last December. Then on January, we had a conference on the trade war with Dr. Christopher Lingle. And today, we will touch the topic of oil economics. If you remember, just at the very beginning of the emergency of COVID-19 in Malaysia, we were surprised by what happened in Saudi and within the OPEC with the decision to increase the supply of oil and the consequent drop in prices. These facts brought some tension, not only among the oil producers, but the concern emerged for all those countries that had quite a dependence of non-fiscal revenues, in particular at the light of the emergency of COVID-19. If you think about Malaysia, this is something that we will discuss later with our speaker. how is going to be financed the stimulus package in the moment in which we can't rely anymore on good income from oil. So these are questions that I think are shared by all of us. And in order to discuss in detail these topics, we have invited a very prestigious speaker, Professor Renato Lima-de-Oliveira, who is from Brazil, but currently living in Malaysia. He is an assistant professor of business and society at the Asian School of Business, and is also a research affiliate at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, where he earned his PhD. He is also a senior fellow at IDEAS and a board member at the CME. Professor Renato has worked as a consultant on energy policy making and teaches different courses on energy markets and international business. So I don't want to steal any more time. We will leave the floor to Professor Renato, who will speak for around 30-35 minutes. And after his talk, the floor will be open for questions. You can type the questions in Zoom. So I will select some of the questions later on to be asked to Professor Renato, and others eventually will be answered directly through the question and answer panel in here. Renato, word to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carmelo. It's my pleasure to be talking to you and talking to so many people from around the world, and to discuss one of my passions, which is the relationship between natural resource extraction and societal consequences, such as availability of physical resource, development of technologies, and so on. So for today, let me, if I may, Carmelo, let me share my screen. As most lectures in the world, we had a virus, which is the PowerPoint virus, and it's really hard to get rid of it. So let me see if this is right. Is this right? Okay, can you see everything in full screen? Is it correct? Oh, okay. So we have immediate, which is related to the COVID-19 demand reduction. Short term, which they were the struggles between OPEC, Saudi Arabia, Russia, but also long-term issues and threats to the oil and gas industry. So what I'm going to try today to you, my dear audience, is to address those immediate effects of this unprecedented demand reduction that we're seeing through the COVID-19, contextualize the recent OPEC plus negotiation breakdown that led to an announcement by Saudi Arabia on early March that they were going to pump more oil and basically let the price in a free fall. But also a little bit on the recent deal, which was just now, April 12th, in light of the economics and politics of oil and gas extraction. So I want to, one of my goals here is that at the end of this webinar, you will try to understand what has been the strategy. Was the Saudis just like crazy to propose that now, or is it linked to something broader? And I will finish by providing reasonable speculations about the long-term legacy of the COVID-19 crisis that may affect oil demand in energy transition, and what it may mean to an oil and gas rich country like Malaysia. So to preview some of the data that I will show, if we are going to live in a world with lower oil price, which seems to be a very likely proposition, between now to 2013, the world will have a reduction of capital investments by 170 billion per year in the oil and gas industry. In governments will reduce their fiscal take, also known as government take, which is a metric that takes into account all the revenues that flows to states, taxes or royalties, profit sharing, and so on, by 616 billion per year. So this is $660 billion per year less flowing to oil-rich countries. And likely we'll see an increase in the share of oil that comes from low-cost source, especially the OPEC countries, thus regaining market share and in part of a battle try to reduce the rate of energy transition. I will also bring, by the end of this talk, some numbers that are specifically to Malaysia. What is going to be the predicted reduction of capital investments and also of fiscal revenues. Are you all with me? Good. So let me start with talking about the economy as a whole. And we know that energy and oil and gas in particular is an important input to the production function of everything that we do from an economic standpoint, right? So we have factories, cars, and so on, and they consume energy, and a lot of the energy comes in the form of oil. So the growth predictions, they also make us to predict how much oil we are going to consume. So this year started with a growth prediction of more than 2%. So if we go for the World Bank Global Economic Prospects, they were predicting 2.5% in 2020, already saying that it's not so good, it's just above the post-crisis low registered last year. But God, I think we would love to have this 2.5% nowadays. The OECD, more recently, in March, was already predicting a drop to 2.4%, still not so bad, but with a caveat that if the coronavirus outbreak spread throughout the Asia-Pacific region, Europe, and North America, things could get considerably worse. So they were thinking that, well, it could drop to 1.5% in 2020. So it was between 2.4 to minus 1.5. And that's by OECD, and that's March, which is kind of hard to believe. It was just last month. For total oil consumption, most predictions at the beginning of the year pointed to a small decline or low growth, right? So if we get the IEA oil market report, which, by the way, a new edition is being launched today, later in Paris, they predicted that it would decrease by just 90,000 barrels a day. So basically, it would stay flat. So in March 9, this is actually very important because that was the day that Saudi Arabia announced that they were going to pump more oil. So in March 9, IEA was predicting a mostly flat oil market for 2020. The EIA, Energy Information Agency from the United States, was actually predicting on March 11 a little bit of growth, 0.4 million barrels per day in 2020. So it was not going to be a significant growth, but it was also not going to decrease. Again, that's March 11. So when we look at even more up-to-date forecasts, they all point to a sharp decline on economic growth and oil demand for the year. So the Restart Energy, they are publishing a COVID-19 report. They are a data set provider for the oil and gas industry. And right now, the biggest source of uncertainty for oil and gas is, well, what's going to happen with the COVID-19? So they're doing quite a good job of modeling the COVID-19 spread rate and some of the impacts of government measures. So they were estimating by March 24, 5% contraction. So from 100 million barrels per day to 95 million barrels per day. In just last week, the IMF came out with a World Economic Outlook that now is predicting a decline of 3% of the economy in 2020. So what we know is that pessimism is on the rise and things have moved really, really, really fast. And why pessimism is on the rise, particularly to the case of energy and oil and gas in particular. So can anyone recognize what's that? Let me see if I can see the chats. I can't actually see any chats here. But if you do recognize, that is our beloved KLIA KL Central, completely empty. And that's a transportation hub. And why it matters for oil is because 29% of all oil, now I can see the chat. Yeah. So 29% of all oil consumption, of 29% of all energy consumption goes to transport. And most transport, by 96% of it, is fueled by liquid fuels, right? So about 1/3 of all energy that we use is for transportation. That's jet fuels, to move your car, to move goods into a maritime trade and so on. And almost all of that is not using oil, up to the point that 57% of all oil demand is used for transportation. So transportation is the core consuming market for oil products. And stay at home doesn't help that, right? So stay at home is actually a very bad thing for the industry. And what we have seen is that airlines around the globe, they park planes with over 70% cancellation rates. We're also not going to see the peak summer travel in US and Europe when we have the summer there and it's lovely to travel. That will cut global consumption of jet fuel by 3 million barrels per day. This image to the right is the KLIA 2 with all the AirAsia planes parked. And the source is Tony Fernandez's Instagram account. By late March, over 40 countries adopted different forms of lockdowns. In 135 of them adopted rules against mass gatherings. So all of that means that people are staying at home, they are not using transportation, and if they are not using transportation, they're not using oil. That makes, we also have data from urban traffic that shows that people are really staying at home. The International Labor Organization, for example, estimates that over 2 billion people, workers, are not working at their office and so on. That may make some people happy, right? It really is going to decrease the amount of carbon emissions. The aviation industry is in a deep problem, but it comes with a huge economic cost, in personal costs, because we also travel to find our loved ones. And by itself, just this COVID-19 would lead to a sharp decline for oil because of the relationship between transport and demand for oil. In normal times, OPEC would be called to regulate supply and promote further cuts. It has been like that most years. Whenever you want, the markets are tight, OPEC promised to increase their extraction rates. Whenever there is excess supply of oil, OPEC tends to cut and tries to manage the price of oil in a way that they act. They are a cartel, but they actually act as a global regulator of the supply of oil. But instead, what we had is that on a Sunday, March 8th, Saudi Arabia announced that it would discount its crude and pump more oil. And in what that appears to be this self-inflicted wound, the OPEC basket went from a peak of $70 to a low of 16 in April. And to the right, you can see some more of the daily variation. So, it pretty much looks huge losses in prices that happened this year. So when the Saudi Arabia decided to start a price war, COVID-19 had infected only 113,000 people worldwide. It was not even considered a pandemic yet by World Health Organization. As I showed before, IEA and other agencies, they were still predicting a flat market for oil for 2020. But on March 12th, it was officially recognized as a pandemic. And now we have what? 2 million people infected with COVID-19. So fast forward a little bit more than a month, from 113 people affected, we now have 2 million. And the number of people under lockdown or cancellations of events and so on has just increased by a lot, which made the industry to face both a supply and a demand shock. So my point here is that Saudi Arabia got the timing wrong, but the decision is part of a broader strategy of regaining market share. And that's going to be really, really important. But to understand that, we need to review the economics and politics of oil production. So I hope to have taken you from these more immediate considerations to now to think more strategically about it. Why Saudi Arabia wanted to say that we are going to decrease prices? We are going to pump up more oil and decrease prices. It just turns out that the timing was really, really bad. But let's understand why that happened. In the oil and gas industry, governments are the owners of reserves through subsoil rights. So with the exception of the United States, every government owns the subsoil. And they also control the rate of extraction, how much oil you can actually take from the ground. They do that by regulations, such as agencies, but also by national oil companies, their own oil operators or regulators, like Saudi Aramco, like Petronas, like Pemex, and others. So the world, the world is actually run by national oil companies. 66% of all the oil reserves of the world are in the hands of NOCs. In longer the days that, oh God. Longer the days that the industry was controlled by the Seven Sisters, which lost power after nationalizations in the 70s. So in the 70s, starting in the 50s, with a lot of contract renegotiation, countries, they increased the rents, they increased their government take, so they increased the amount of money that they made per barrel sold, and later they expropriated international oil companies operating in their countries, and they started to extract by themselves. And that was helped by a coordination through the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, which now is celebrating 60 years. It was created to coordinate production between these large oil exporters and increase the revenues. So OPEC, for example, they would share information about negotiation between big oil companies in different countries. So they would know what different members were doing, with the common goal of increasing the amount of rents that they would be able to extract. But OPEC had always to walk a fine line between restricting output too much, saying that, oh, we are not going to produce, like any cartel, you want to reduce output in order to increase prices. The problem with that is that it encourages oil-to-oil competition. So it encourages investments in non-OPEC countries, but also substitutes other ways of using different sources of energy. And the fine line was between that and producing too fast and extracting too much, which would to accelerated reserve depletion, right? So you want to balance the market in a way that you don't extract too fast and you sell for what you think would be cheap. But you also don't want to restrict too much, that oil companies are going to try to find oil wherever they can in the rest of the world in non-OPEC countries. or they will invest more into renewables. In another issue of OPEC, like any cartel, is that it has a problem of coordinating who will bear the cost of production cuts, because it's in the best interest of everyone. Everyone gains from cutting back production, increasing prices, and so on. But it will gain the most the member who doesn't cut production, but the others do. So the price increases, but you keep your same market share, and your revenues is going to be market share times price. So you have that benefit. So OPEC always had fights between themselves, between their members, on how to monitor if each member was actually doing the cuts that they promised. So let me address here the issue of the high oil price encouraged competition. In the late 70s, high oil price encouraged production from frontier areas like offshore North Sea and Mexico. That led to an overproduction and a price collapse in the 80s. So after the first OPEC oil shock, after the second OPEC oil shock, companies started to do offshore projects that before that they were not profitable. But at then prevailing market price, it was actually a good investment. But once this new supply came to the market, it led to price collapse later in the 80s. Similarly, in the mid-2010s, high oil price helped the shale revolution in the US in exploration and production in ultra-deep waters. That includes, for example, the pre-salt in Brazil. Price collapsed in 2014 following a decision by Saudi Arabia to regain market share from shale, thinking that, okay, we are going to increase production again, that will bring price down, and then the shale producers will be out of the market. That not happened like that. It did have a dent in the market, but what it made was shale producers having to invest into being more efficient, reduce their break-even price. So OPEC countries, they have the lowest cost of production. They can play with that. They can increase production, they can decrease, and they are always profitable for oil price that normally any oil price above $15, they can make money. It's not the case for most other countries. But even at $60, they risk losing market share to non-OPEC producers. So the more they cut, the more they invite competition. So by restricting output, that's what cartels they do. They're also telling the rest of the world that doesn't belong to that cartel to go and try to find and explore more oil. And that's what has happened in US, Brazil, Norway, and so on. Traditionally, Saudi Arabia had done most of this job of doing the cuts. Saudi Arabia has the biggest share of swing production capacity. Saudi Arabia can, at any moment, say that we are going to increase production by 1 million barrels per day. Other countries, they don't invest in that spare capacity to the same extent. So Saudi Arabia has been the de facto regulator of the OPEC behavior. But sometimes they do get tired of doing that. In the long-term strategy, it has always been that, well, it's okay that these the investors are going to non-OPEC countries. They can take oil from US, from Brazil, Norway, and so on, but one day they will run dry, right? And then they will have to come back to Middle East. They will have to be our consumers, correct? Well, to understand that, we need to go to the definition of reserves, to the idea of oil as a non-renewable resource, but one that we actually don't know for sure how much oil we have left in the ground. And that's because the estimates of available reserves, they depend on exploration intensity, current technologies, and price. So you know that you have more oil, first of all, and in order to really estimate how much oil you have available, you need to explore. You need to get some areas, acreage, You need to do seismic and geochemical analysis and so on. Then, depending on the technology available, one resource that could not be classified as a reserve, it can be rebooked as a reserve if with current technology and price, you can profitably extract it. So what we have is, despite all oil already consumed in the world, total amount of reserves has continued to grow. And that is very, very powerful. Currently, we have enough oil to sustain current consumption for 50 years. So what we have here in this graph, it's the annual production since the 80s. Annual production almost always increasing. And then, so annual production in 1,000 barrels per day. Right now, we consume about 100 million barrels per day. And we have, in blue, the total amount of proved reserves. And the metric is really, really different. It's 1,000 million barrels, right? So we're talking about a billion barrels here. And we can see that in this period from early 80s to late 2018, the total amount of reserves doubled. So we have been consuming more and more oil each year at the same time that we find more and more oil for the future. In this indicator, the reserve to production indicator, it varies across countries. But in non-OPEC countries, it's 24 years. So if they don't invest in any more exploration, or if there's no technological progress to reduce cost of production and also the recovery rates, they would be able to extract at the current rate for another 24 years. But in OPEC countries, they have 86 years left of reserves at the rate that they extract today, right? That's a lot of time. I'm probably not going to be around to see the end of the oil reserves in Middle Eastern countries. Not only OPEC has larger reserves, but also it has lower cost of extraction. So here we see in red the OPEC countries, in the x-axis the amount of production of oil and gas as barrels of oil equivalent in the cost of production. So most OPEC countries, they are going to have a cost of production not much more than $10 or $12. While a country like Brazil, it's over 20, while US is also over 20. So what it means is that OPEC countries, they could be adding much more capacity because they have the lowest cost and they have these huge reserves. And in fact, standard economic theory would expect production to continue until marginal cost equal price. So they could be flooding the market. They could say that we are not going to see any oil coming from tar sands in Canada. This is super expensive. We are not going to see oil coming from ultra deep offshore from Brazil or from shale in the US, as long as if they were willing to extract more. But since they control price, they invite competition. So what we have is this reality where higher costs in the world, areas with these higher costs, they have been developed before low-cost areas from OPEC countries deplete. This has worked well. This is part of a strategy. If you believe that there will be a market for your reserves in the future, so if you have enough reserves for 86 years, and you believe that once the amount of reserves in these other countries, they're going to go down, and if oil is still under high demand, maybe people will pay more for your production. So it's fine to keep on the ground. However, if you believe that's not going to be the case, you might be better off selling it now, regaining market share. So we are living a paradigm shift. it's the risk of substitutes. So from the old paradigm that we want to avoid, and we by OPEC countries, we want to avoid too fast production. Now it may be the case that you want to avoid of a too slow production, because the cost of renewables, they have been going down dramatically in the last decade. On a levelized cost of energy basis, electricity generation is now cheaper for renewables. But they still have a big issue, which is intermittency. So you still need the sun to shine, the wind to blow. But as battery costs, they decrease, in electric vehicles gain market share, oil and gas will have a credible substitute. Remember that 57% of the consumption of oil goes to transportation. And if we have more and more electric vehicles, EVs are essentially big batteries on wheels. And EVs can be fueled with the energy that comes from renewables. And that can lead this paradigm shift from the point of view of policymakers in OPEC, that rather than producing too fast, they have the risk of producing too slow in having assets that will be stranded, that they are just losing value, that they are not going to be economic monetizable. And in fact, a study by BNP Paribas called Wells, Wires and Wheels calculated that the long-term break-even price for gasoline is around 11 to 12, and for diesel 17 to 19 when compared to electric vehicles. And why? It's because EVs, they are much more energy efficient. So you get much more mobility out of the same amount of energy that you put into a EV, much more than ICE, internal combustion engine. So for OPEC countries, perhaps it's time to accelerate the rate of extraction on purpose to reduce price, and perhaps delay the transition of energy, and also to recapture the market share that has been lost to other countries. In fact, the International Energy Agency, in one interesting recent study called the Oil and Gas Industry Energy Transitions, they see that the idea of OPEC countries, oil and gas rich countries, speeding up their rate of extraction as one of the possible scenarios of resource holders fully utilizing their spare capacity to force high cost producers out of the market. In that document that was released in January, remember at the time that the oil price was $70, already saw one scenario whereby the oil price would suddenly drop to below $25 a barrel and then remain in a range between 25 to 35, right? So that was already one of the things that we had in mind as a consequence. So that is the strategic shift here. What happened was that at the same time we had the COVID-19. So that led to a huge demand reduction. So let me quickly go through some of the consequences. If low oil price might be here to stay, what's going to be the consequence of that? And one of the things I did was to use a data set with the break-even price of field by field of all the producing fields in the world, and checking what is the price, the minimum price required to keep them in operation or to invest in their capacity. And from that, we can estimate how much production we will lose at $30 and how much government revenues in capital investments will also be under threat. So here's in this first graph is the amount of production loss. So if we go from $30, if we go from 60, more or less what we had before, to $30, we are going to lose a lot of 1,000 barrels per day, million barrels per day, right? So it's about 25 million barrels per day of production loss up to 2030, considering current investment plans and fields under development. Who might take up the tab here? OPEC countries. So they might be the ones who will invest in supplying this capacity at $30, because in a lot of other countries, $30 is not enough to entice investors. And what about capital investments? What about when oil and gas companies, they actually pay for building new platforms, for drilling wells and so on. So we also see a huge impact in total amount of capital investments. Finally, the sector of the economy that profits most from oil and gas is actually governments, because of the amount of taxes and also because they own national oil companies. In the fall of revenues will be drastic. We are talking about going from almost $1 trillion per year to about 260 billion per year. So to summarize, here are some numbers. Based on that exercise, field by field analysis, I estimate that a change of price from $60 to $30 will result in a decrease in a fall of capital investments of $170 billion per year. So unfortunately, these are less jobs for people in the oil and gas supply chain, in platforms, in shipyards, in the operations, and so on. We see a smaller amount of losses in operation expenditures, just the nature of that business. It's easier to cut new exploration, new investments, but you tend to keep the ones that are already producing. But the impact into government take is huge. We are talking about 616 billion on average per year globally. For Malaysia, we see a decline of $1.7 billion per year on average from 2020 to 2030. So these are investments that at the current prices and current technology, they are not profitable and likely will not be undertaken. And the government is scheduled to lose $7.3 billion. The total production, the total amount of volume loss is not a lot. Malaysia is more of a gas exporter, and its production has been more or less stable, but you would still have a loss of 0.341 million barrels of oil per day. And that may be the new normal. So let me bring that news story from Brazil, from Petrobras, which is a company that invests in ultra deep offshore. And after the decision by Saudi Arabia, they basically looked carefully at everything that they do to reduce their production costs. And the CEO said, we are preparing to live with a cost of oil of $25, with a price of oil of $25 and not $40. So they delayed hiring, they stopped promotions, and they cut back 200,000 barrels per day of production. Why? Because you cut production that is only marginally profitable first. So that's the thing that this OPEC plus deal on April 12 did. There are countries that when they cut production, and those are OPEC countries, they lose revenue. That because they have low cost of production, by saying that I'm cutting, I'm actually losing revenue. There are other countries, including United States and some of other marginal producers, that they have fields that do not break even at those costs, and markets would tell them to stop producing. So these are the cuts that are market driven. The OPEC cuts are much more politically driven. And that's the different dynamics between OPEC versus non-OPEC producers. So let me get to the conclusion. The full impact of the COVID-19 is still very hard to assess, but we will have at least 5% demand reduction for 2020. And unfortunately, it's not looking much better as the days pass by. This demand shock also coincided with a supply shock, which was triggered by existing problems within OPEC, and the idea that Saudi Arabia may want to monetize its large reserves before they get stranded. Remember, OPEC countries, they have reserves for 85 years, non-OPEC for 25. If you believe that the energy transition, even though it might be slow, but by the end of this decade, it's likely that we will reach peak consumption, that the total amount of oil we consume per day will reach its peak, and then it's going to decrease just because we are finding it more profitable and also more environmentally adequate to substitute for renewables or to invest in energy efficiency. Then what's the gain of staying with oil field that could last for 86 years for a production that will have no market, right? So that's a major change. And also one conclusion of that is that for the E&P sector, be prepared for a capex reduction of the order of 170 billion per year if the prices stay around $30. And by that, I'm not saying that I'm predicting the price will stay for $30. But it's if it stays at 30, that's the total amount of investment at risk. We might see a lot of price fluctuation, and that is very, very normal in the oil and gas industry. But now we have reasons to think that the trend is downward rather than an upward trend. That was the main assumption in most of the 20th century. The whole idea that if you have oil, save it, because as the world consumes it, reserves would get depleted, people would still need it, and they will pay more for that. That assumption is now basically not true, or people stop believing that if it was ever true. For what are the long-lasting legacy of COVID-19 that may affect the transportation sector? I think the work from home may be something that can result in a dent into amount of transportation. As firms all over the world, they develop policies and infrastructure to allow workers to work from home, that might just happens more. So this is a shock, but a shock that led to human resource departments of companies all over the world to develop new policies, to move some systems to the cloud and allow people to be more mobile in that sense, to not have to go to an office. And that may stay, and that may limit the demand for transportation. I'm also very concerned with the breakup of global supply chains, with political pressures to have countries more developing an autarkic type of development, and rather than allowing goods to free flow all over the world. That can result into an impact into demand for transportation. One important takeaway is that we are seeing an energy transition. In oil-rich countries may speed up extraction. For countries that are not that oil-rich, into every country in particular, for Malaysia, the key message is diversify. Don't bet your future into oil and gas revenues. It's going to be even more volatile and with a downward trend. And we are going to see likely an increase in the share of OPEC oil production, just because they do have a lot of oil, and the whole idea of stranded assets much more important to them than to non-OPEC oil producers. So let me finish with some reading suggestions. I highly recommend one book by Maurice Alderman. He was an energy economist based at MIT, and he wrote two fantastic books: The Economics of Petroleum Supply. This is a little bit more technical. Another, which is more historical, The Genie Out of the Bottle. And one of the things that I really appreciate about Alderman is his clarity and literary style. So when you read that, you will also see great references. And one a little bit more recent book on history of oil is Leonardo Malgeri. He was an executive at ENI. I also had the pleasure of meeting him before he passed away. And this is a great history from the point of view of a practitioner of the age of oil. There are many books about oil economics or oil history, but I'm recommending that because they are kind of a less known in comparison to the price, for example. Finally, if you are interested in all of these energy related issues, I hope you can join one of my energy classes where we cover all aspects from the business of oil and gas to energy policies and a lot related to energy transition, the business of solar PV, of wind, of hydrogen, and so on. So with that, I will turn back to Carmelo, and I thank you so much. Looking forward to answer any questions you might have.
Hey, thank you very much, Renato, for the enlightening presentation. I can be the only one that claps to you, so I'm sure that all our virtual audience was enlightened and excited by your presentation. So now we have some questions that starts to come from the floor, but before we go to the floor and we allow some time for them to think, I would like to pose you a question on energy transition. Beyond mythology and ideology, where do we stand in terms of energy transition? I mean, oil producers should be seriously concerned about the possibility of a radical shift from oil to something else or not. And I tell you this because recently I was in discussion with companies that do certificate trading on carbon certificates. So people that get recognition because they do something that save the environment and diminish the emission coming from oil. And the benefit that these companies get is usually in terms of corporate social responsibility. So they do this for image, but in the long run, probably you cannot run a business because of the gain that you get in terms of images. You need flash, you know, in terms of cost reduction or technological jump. So where the reality is pointing out.
If we were having this conversation about 5 years ago, and definitely 10 years ago, it would be easy to say that renewables were a big wishful thinking that was fueled by subsidies, and at some point society would be tired of paying that high price and so on. Nowadays, renewables can actually be the cheapest option available, but they go to a certain market, and that market is for the electricity production, right? The renewable for transportation and biofuels, it's much more of a niche. We don't have we don't have a rate of growth of biofuels as much as we do have for solar PV and wind. What happened is that we had an amazing learning curve in decrease of the cost of capital and investments of solar PV and wind energy. So they became really, really competitive, and they are taking out from the market first coal production. But the integration of renewables into okay, so someone asked to stop share. Let me. So someone wanted to see my face. Hello, Tricia. Yes. So the integration of renewables is challenging. The integration of renewables in the grid is challenging because of intermittency, because of a move between passive to active producers and decentralized energy production and so on. However, even oil and gas companies, they are finding in their best interest, for example, to have offshore wind projects tied to platforms, so they do not consume the natural gas for self-consumption. So you can power a platform by using the gas that is being extracted. But you can also do that by using the energy from the wind around a platform, and thus saving the gas to sell it to countries. And the same with floating solar PV and other solutions. So now, even oil and gas companies, they are integrating in their own business, and not talking about separate business departments or CSR or anything like that. Is that for electrical energy, it might be sometimes the lowest cost of production. And also we have experienced in the last 10 years, very, very low interest rates. In the fact of renewable energy is that it's high capex, low opex. So you have to invest a lot into buying all the materials, assembling the things, but then the marginal cost is almost zero. The marginal cost for offshore wind or wind is a little bit higher, but for solar PV, it's almost zero. So what it means is that low interest rates also has helped to boost the production of renewable source. So short answer to you is that the critical thing right now is what is the learning curve of batteries and of different forms of grid integration. If we continue to have, as we are having, constant cost reduction per megawatt hour in batteries, the more we are going to see higher rates of penetration of renewable energy, up to the point that it might be cheaper than the operational costs of a gas plant or a coal plant. So it might be cheaper to work with a renewable energy solar farm rather than just buying the gas. There is a framework for that. We actually explore that in the classroom. It would take me more time to talk about that. But the short answer is we are in transition points. We have already passed the threshold, which is to show that on a levelized cost of energy, renewable energy would be cheaper. Now we need to get to the point where dispatchable renewable energy could be cheaper than fossil fuels. Dispatchable in the sense of that you can store and then you can sell it, and the overall cost of the system to be cheaper. We will get there. The specific date will vary, but the fact that you're now with lower oil price will delay that a bit.
Yep.
But
I have two questions from the floor that are related with this topic. One is if you can make a temporal prediction on when renewable supply efficiency can meet global energy demand. And the second one, so I make you two because are related. Given the falling cost of the renewable energy and Malaysia's abundance of resources, what explains Malaysia's high use of coal?
Very, very, very good questions. So I see a question from Zainal Abidin. Fantastic person, extremely experienced in this industry. And he's asking if there's a chance of another crude price war to escalate again.
Yeah.
I don't think that right now, I don't think that the OPEC deal is going to stand much. I think that OPEC countries are going to cut. It's a very, very low oil price. I think that other countries will have to cut because they are marginal. Some of their fields do not pay at that price, so they will cut. The big question will be, what will be the world after COVID-19? What is going to be the new oil demand and kind of the natural rate of growth for oil demand? I don't think we know yet. So I wouldn't bet in high prices, unfortunately, to my friends in the sector. We had the question about coal, but you had another one, Carmelo. Sorry, can you say it again?
So 2 is if you can estimate when actually renewable energies would be available, will be able to meet energy demand, and the other was why there is still a high consumption of coal in Malaysia.
Okay, so when renewable energy will be able to supply our energy demand, it will vary across country. There are technical barriers to that, including the issue of energy storage. But there are also different policy dynamics. Some countries, they have invested in policies to speed up that transition, and they will see, so say, or even states like California, so they will see a much faster rate of supply from renewables, and basically mothballing their old fossil fuel plants. So rather than thinking about when the world as a whole is going to be based on renewable energy, it makes sense to do an analysis country by country or even region by region. And that is influenced by the gains from market for renewable energy supply chain that reduces the cost of installation, increases the amount of, you have the gains from scale as more people get into the market selling solutions, and some of them customized or others not, but then it reduces the cost, increase the take up of that, and also the policies. But one of the benefits is that as technology progress, and for example, the cost of the solar PV modules continues to go down, even latecomers, countries that didn't invest first in putting those policies, they will benefit from it. So they might catch up really, really fast later. So I think that's going to happen. Someone's also asking about natural gas and LNG in this picture. Yeah. In most predictions about future demand for energy, natural gas is the only fossil fuel that is still predicted to grow. It is the cleanest of the fossil fuels, and the one that can best play a role in the integration of renewables. So with natural gas, you can have backup generators that give the system, the grid, the necessary stability to accommodate an increasing share of an intermittent source of energy. In this case, the solar or wind. So there is a big role for natural gas in the energy transition. It's going to be there. It serves as a source of energy that can definitely replace coal. It has about 50% less carbon content than coal, and it integrates better because of the time that it takes, the ramp-up time to generate electricity from a natural gas plant versus a coal plant. And answering one question about why Malaysia has so much coal, this is something that we've explored in a paper with ideas and other works. I think that that's an area where better targeted policies should be at play to also recognize the cost in terms of the environment and of particulates of having coal. So when you take into account these other costs of coal, it's not necessarily the cheapest source. It has increased because if you put it to bid, And if you don't take those factors into account, you end up with kilowatt hour price that is going to be cheaper than many other alternatives. But I think that one of the role of policy making is to want to be to account for hidden costs and to really prepare the country to navigate these changes. So I do believe that the coal policy in Malaysia should be reviewed.
Thank you, Renato. There is an interesting question here on the possibility of a merge between Petronas and TNB to explore more on the production and adoption of renewable energy. What's your take on that?
Good question. Petronas is already investing into renewables. It's a typical oil and gas company, but it's also investing in renewables. At the same time, TNB is known as the utility of Malaysia. I think that in this case I prefer competition, and I think that it's what we see in the world is that there is an interesting thing. We are consuming more and more electricity. But it doesn't mean that traditional utility companies are the winners of the energy transition.
This is a very Schumpeterian answer.
Yeah. So the new energy companies, they're more they have a leaner structure. They are more innovation based. They are less about getting a return just based on the regulation. They are involved in a world of an active consumer base rather than a passive consumer base. So I actually believe that the role of the government should not be trying to merge two giants, but rather allow new entrants to that market and let people compete.
It's a very thanks for the answer, because this is actually typical Schumpeterian answer. As I was mentioning, Schumpeter was always pointing out that innovations that brings new doing things in a new way comes from different men, different entrepreneurs, different companies. This is a key element in innovation. It's difficult to get a computer out of a typing machine company. So this is the point. So we have a lot of questions on OPEC and Saudi Arabia. One is about what's your thought on Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund amassing stakes in European oil companies, including Equinor, Total, Shell, and Eni? And then, do you expect OPEC to announce any new policy direction at the light of COVID-19?
Yeah, so on the first question, if they're trying to manipulate international oil companies, I don't know. That might be just a diversification strategy. It might be trying to influence board decisions, but then you would need much more higher share of stocks in order to have a say. And also, a lot of those companies like Equinor, they operate under the legislation and the policies of the countries where they are based, and also the values of their home state. So Equinor has been very, very strongly coming into renewables, integrating with their own operations of oil and gas. So how much of the any influence that sovereign wealth fund of Saudi Arabia will have on that, I don't know. I think it's an interesting open question. I don't have a lot to speculate on that. Then we have another question on, could it be that we use more coal because our power generation plants are those that are still coal-fired power plants? Yes. Malaysia is using more coal because there are more coal-fired power plants. But the puzzle is that 20 years ago, coal was minimal. coal was extremely limited in the Malaysia's energy matrix. It was a policy decision to increase coal, in part because of the low investments into new gas production and the idea of trying to keep the energy price low by increasing the share of coal. So that was a policy decision, but let me say that it doesn't take into account all the environmental costs of that. And I think that we should. And coal is the easiest one to be replaced by gas and by renewables. I think Trish also asked about a new deal with OPEC.
Yep.
Pretty much what we have today is that even a 10 million barrels cut, it's not enough to balance the market given this sudden and huge demand decline. So what has been happening is that, just imagine like a flow of pipes. So on the one hand, you have like a big pipe that used to have an output of 100 million barrels. And then on the other hand, you have another pipe that is where your production goes, that used to have 100 million barrels of capacity, of flow capacity. Now it's only accepting perhaps 80. So there is a surplus of 20 here. Part of that is going to storage in oil tankers, big tankers, onshore, and there is a limit to that. So some companies start to buy that cheap oil thinking that, oh, it's so cheap that we'll put it into storage, price will rebound, and then I will sell that at a profit. But if the consumption pipe here, where you want to deliver the oil, it stays at that low demand, the amount of storage is going to be limited. So you have to change the amount of oil that you pump out of the ground. So if the situation continues to be that bad, yes, we will need to see more cuts. There will be just excess oil and no storage capacity.
Thank you. We have two last questions, then we will close this session. Just before you answer and we close the session, you will find the presentation and the audio recording in the next days on our website, marketedu.org, and the audio recording will be posted also on our Facebook page. So look for Center for Market Education on Facebook, and there you will find the link with the audio recording. Of course, you will also be updated with the new initiatives which are always posted on our Facebook page. Now the two last questions. Do you see a future where OPEC and global supply leave reserves in the ground? And what happens if production costs stay above market price? And last one, the role of petrol stations in a future where energy production is more decentralized.
Great. I'm very happy to see a question by Michael Burke. Do you see a future where OPEC and global supply leave reserves in the ground? Yes, one where there's no market for oil. And we will gradually see that much earlier than 86 years from now. So one of the things that history has shown us in technological progress is that if there is a price, we tend to find more oil and gas. So resource, they are a function of this exploration intensity, technology, and price. So we have enough reserves right now for 50 years. We are likely going to see a peak of consumption. So it's not going to be the case anymore that you need to find more in order to keep the same ratio, but rather is the consumption will start to go down and you still have huge reserves. And if you want, you could find even more or increase the recovery rates of reservoirs, which today we only recover about 30% of each oil field reservoir. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that those countries they will have to think about a different business. They have been in the oil business for years, especially is from the 50s onwards. And they will face, politically, they will face huge issues of how to accommodate sectors of society that have been used to live off rents. These are rentier societies. There's a huge literature in political science and economic development about that. But these type of reforms, they are becoming more and more important. Thank you, Mike, for that question. So for the second question here, what would be the future of decentralized energy production look like for everyday transportation? This is an exciting future, one that you will be the producer of energy and you'll be connected to many other decentralized producers. In energy price will be rated on real time. It might be the case, as it happens in different countries, that around noon, like now, you might have maximum production of solar energy, and the marginal cost of electricity might go to zero. So you might have free electricity at certain times of the day, and you might take that electricity to use in your car. You might charge your EV for when prices are zero, and you're actually providing a public good to the grid, because we don't want to have excess energy. In that can lead to a totally different market structure, one that it's much more important, the capacity, planning of just the capacity rather than the marginal price of it. One that you might not have the same amount of base load generators that you have now, but just more peak capacity generators, just to accommodate sudden shifts. So we do explore that in the classroom, these different scenarios and how they impact different businesses around the world. So it's kind of a long thing. There is some scenario planning about that and imagination, but technically it has been already adopted in different markets.
Thank you very much, Renato. Thanks to all the attendees. I hope that you enjoyed the event. This is our first webinar. Hopefully we will arrange more soon, and hopefully we will be able also to do some physical event also very soon. This is my hope. Please follow us on Facebook, take a look at our website, and keep in touch. Thanks, Renato, again, and see you all. Stay safe.
My pleasure.
Bye-bye.
Bye.